Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 3, The 32nd Day of Planting, Part 3 of 3. That afternoon, Ralph looked into his grandmother's eyes. Last chance, Mugga. Peto and Lilla stood a little ways off, hoping their oldest son could make her see reason. The rest of their family had already said quick goodbyes earlier. To keep the smaller children from worrying too much, it was decided that the actual farewells would involve only the grandparents and would be as brief as possible. Besides, the separation would be only temporary, and they could handle anything temporarily, right? Mari hugged Ralph. I know. Thank you. Take care of this sweet family of yours, all right, until I get there? She released him to hug Madeline. Mugga, you need to go with us, Madeline pleaded. You're the matriarchal cow. Mari paused. Now, Maddie, I've been called many things over the years, but what? Ralph chuckled. Elk, Mugga. She's talking elk again. Madeline blushed apologetically. For my animal studies class, we followed elk and tracked one large herd for 3 seasons. Do you ever find living with a stonecutter completely dull, Madeline? Murray interrupted. Her grandson's wife wasn't about to be distracted. The herd was massive and moved as one body, or so it seemed. But there was one matriarchal cow, and no elk entered a meadow or went down a canyon until she gave her approval. Even the bulls waited for her. Mari squeezed her arm. I know all about that cow. Your professor came to me some years ago, worried how I might react if the news got back to me about that cow's nickname. Nickname? Ralph frowned. Madeline blushed again. For the papers and reports we presented, she was labeled M1, Matriarch 1, but in the field everyone always called her Mari. Ralph snorted a laugh. I never knew that. Madeline shrugged. I didn't know Mugga knew either. Leaning in, Mari said, I know all kinds of things. Hesitantly, Ralph asked, Was there a Perrin? Madeline nodded sadly. Biggest bull anyone ever saw. Half of the herd came from them. After he died, M1 continued on alone, without another bull. Ralph sighed, and Mari said nothing, but looked down at the ground and pushed around a pebble in the slush with her boots. See why you have to come, Mugga? Madeline tried again. You're the matriarch of the family. You should be there first, leading everyone else up there, securing the site. Be there to watch as the rest of your herd arrives. That's very sweet, Maddie. Mari looked up to kiss her cheek. But I can't go. My herd's not all here yet. Now, she said more brightly, you be careful. I keep thinking about Grunnock running over to see the view from the cliff. Then come with us, Madeline insisted. Sit on Grunnock so I can nurse Sarai. Mari chuckled. Well, that's why you're taking Q. If a 15-year-old boy can't keep up with him, how could I do any better? Q smiled at his grandmother, resembling Perrin and young Pear, so much more each day that Mari sometimes found it painful to look at him. I could always use your help, Mugga. I'll do the next best thing, she said, as she crouched to speak to her 3.5-year-old grandson. She ruffled his blonde hair, very much like his father's. Now, you be a good boy, Grunnock. You stay far away from the cliff and climb all over that ruin instead. Mugga! Ralph exclaimed. Mari winked at him. Just don't let your papa see you do it, all right? Grunnock grinned. All right, Mugga. You coming soon? Of course. Now give me a squeeze. Ooh, you nearly squeezed my breath out of me. Remember, I love you. I want you to be careful and do help your mama with your baby sister. If I have to, he sighed. I love you too, Mugga. Mari gave him a kiss, then stood up and took her 9 moons old great-granddaughter out of Madeline's arms. You be a good girl too, all right, Sarai? Sleep for your parents. Don't crawl through the muddy snow and stay in your tent. Understand? The baby grabbed Mari's face, and her great-grandmother gave her a big kiss and one last hug. Ralph helped Madeline up on the horse, then took his daughter out of Mari's arms and handed her up to Madeline. Please, Mugga, Madeline said. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of help up there. The first groups from Region 1 should be there by the time you reach it, she said as Ralph mounted his horse. Pato stepped over and picked up Grunnock to hand him to his father. Lilla was already over at Madeline's side, patting the baby. I promise I'll be there soon, Mari said. Lori and Jory and their families will be leaving tomorrow, so make sure you have a big enough area up there to camp with them. Lilla gave Q an enormous embrace. Before he took the reins of the pack mule carrying Ralph's stone-cutting tools, he came back to Mugga for one more hug. I can take care of you, Mugga. I know you can. You're a wonderful young man, Q, Mari said, kissing his neck. Thank you. Q blinked away some tears and gripped the reins. We love you, Lilla reminded them. Be safe, you're not in a hurry. They know it all, Lilla, Pato assured her, but he looked anxious as well. It'll be fun, Grandma Lilla, Grunnock beamed. And when we come back, we can look at all the rocks I collected. The adults tried to keep smiles on their faces, but there would be no coming back, as far as anyone knew. Mari cleared the lump in her throat and patted Grunnock's leg. That's right, sweetie. You get a nice big collection up there waiting for us to inspect. We'll be up there before you know it. Lilla choked back a sob and put on another big fake smile for Grunnock's benefit. Now, Pato said, be sure to leave the animals far enough away so they won't wander to the site. There's that spring up there. That would be good. Papa, Ralph cut him off. I remember. I've been doing these routes my whole life. Pato cleared his throat. Carve those words good and deep, Ralph. I want them to last 1,000 years. I love you. Go. He slapped his son's horse and stood between his wife and mother, putting an arm around each of them as they watched the first of their family head first north, then turn west to the middle route that started beyond Deck's grazing pastures and past the low hills. Mari sighed. Oh, one goodbye down. How many more to go? Lilla sniffled. Too many. Not enough. Oh, I'm so confused. I wish they weren't alone. Pato hugged her shoulders. Cephas told me at least 200 people from our region have decided to get a head start for this site. Ralph and his family will meet up with someone soon. It's really happening, isn't it? Mari whispered. I can't believe it. Yet it feels like I've lived this day before, as if this year is lifted out of time. But I don't know where it set us. Lilla thought about that. I really didn't understand that, Mari. But if you're trying to say it feels odd, then I agree. That's exactly what I meant, Lilla. Well, she said abruptly, I should get back to Jatesy's. I think all the packs are ready, but I wanted to make one last count. I'll bring over the packs for the 2 Cadby families so they'll be ready. Without waiting for any comments, Mari turned and headed to the Brighter's home, wiping away random tears. She wanted to stay in Salem until the very end, but she also knew that was selfish. Someone would have to give her a ride up to the site, since she was never very stable alone on horseback. She was sure she could walk it, but if she waited to see the army come out of the canyon, she'd be too late at her slow pace. She'd hate to miss the last day because she was stuck on the trail, having lost track as to how many slash marks she was supposed to count. How would she explain that one? She thought to herself with a quiet chuckle. Wasn't the last day amazing? Everyone would say to each other. Did you expect it to happen that way? What did you think of it, Mari? And she would turn red and confess, "I missed it. I wanted to see the army march in. Then I got lost on the path, so I put my feet up to rest. Then I heard trumpets sounding from the sky, and I realized I was too late." Yes, that's what would likely happen, she decided as she reached Jatesy's porch. The head of Salem's University History Department would miss the greatest event of their history. She found the packs lined up neatly on the front porch. Some grandchild finished the checking for her, probably Tabit. She was a natural organizer and would be the one to label each pack by name. Mari picked up the first few for the 2 Cadby families. They were heavier than she expected, so with 4 adults and 7 children, she'd need to make 3 trips. But that was all right. Walking always gave her time to think, even if it was just between the houses. And she usually thought about her future, but strangely, today, there was none. It was a most disconcerting feeling. She could always imagine what the future held, and sometimes could even vaguely discern what might be coming her way. But now she felt nothing. Only until breakfast tomorrow, then. That her thoughts dropped off so abruptly left her troubled, to put it mildly. So often that day she prayed, "Why can't I sense any further?" But the only answer that came was, "You know enough." More than once she wondered about Perrin. He knew that he was going to die a few days beforehand. He confided in Mari that even before he got stabbed by that ridiculous stick, he knew his time had grown short and that he was needed for another duty. Had he felt something like this emptiness about the future? He seemed so sure, so full of determination to accept his fate. He likely even knew just when he would die, too. That's why they had rested under the trees on that bench that last beautiful, hot afternoon. How long he'd been planning his death, he never told her. Now she wished she'd asked him for a few more details, but at the time she was too shocked that he was actually leaving her. Mari placed the packs on the porch of the Shin's house, oblivious to her son watching her from the window, and turned back to wander over to the Briders. She tried to pull out of her mind any feelings of moving on, or not waking up, or whatever else it might be that those who are to die feel to tell them their time is ending. Why didn't those who were dying write down exactly what they were experiencing? Mari shook her head at the absurd notion that dying people would spend their last days analyzing their reactions to dying. She searched her mind for any clue that the Creator might have dropped about her end, but there was nothing. Bordering on disappointed, she walked up the steps of the Briders, not noticing Jatesy and Deck observing her through their window as she picked up the lighter children's packs and started down the stairs again. No, she wasn't about to die soon. That was both comforting and disconcerting. So why couldn't she think past a day at a time? She reached the Shin house again and dropped the packs on the porch, now being observed through the window by Pato, Lilla, and 3 concerned granddaughters. She went down the stairs and looked to the south, to the canyon that would deliver her husband and her grandson. How would Perrin make his presence known to her? Give her a tremendous hug like he did when he left? Would she suddenly feel him lying next to her in bed again? Would she see his face in Pato or Deck or Shem? She reached the Briders' porch and picked up the last of the Cadby bags. To the audience of 6 Briders behind the window, fascinated that she didn't notice any of them. Back down the stairs she went, imagining every kind of possibility to feeling Perrin again. He would say her name. She would hear his sonorous voice in her mind, and it would fill her body. She would smell him, too, earthy sweet. How he could invoke his scent in her mind she didn't know, but it was a trick she'd insist he reveal. Then she would feel him, strong, large, and completely enveloping her. She stopped in her tracks, lost in the imagination of his presence again. It had been so long since she'd felt him that when it happened again, she surely would lose her ability to breathe and think. She'd be reduced to a puddle, sobbing that he'd returned. So many different variations of Perrin filled her mind. With his snowy white hair and deep dark eyes, when he kissed her before that last marking trip, the way he appeared at the dinner in Idemea in his full dress uniform, with his black hair sprinkled with the beginnings of gray, the way he looked at her the first time as he stepped onto the platform as a young 28-year-old captain with short black hair, and how he stopped in surprise to see a young woman instead of an old spinster schoolteacher. What form he was in now, she didn't know. She hoped that somehow it would be a combination of all of them. Each age was his greatest, she thought, and she ached to feel him next to Mother. She opened her eyes, her vision blurry with tears, but she could make out Jatesy standing in front of her, with Lilla to the side, and Pato and Dec, then several grandchildren behind them, all of them wearing expressions of extreme worry. Confused, she wondered why they were all there. Something must have happened. Mother, Jatesy repeated gently, you've been standing here for about 10 minutes. We thought maybe you fell asleep or something. Are you all right? Nothing had happened except for nosy families. Fell asleep while I was standing here? She said tonelessly. Yes, that would be a good trick. Why did they fret so much? It wasn't as if she was a little girl lost in the woods. She was a mature woman who had solved more problems and conquered more fears than any of them. So why should they be all staring at her now? Enough, she declared. There's nothing wrong with me. I just wanted a little time to think. But all of you hover so much that I can't spend even 10 minutes alone with my thoughts between your houses. Jatesy and Lilla looked at each other, embarrassed. Pato smiled sheepishly and looked down at his feet. But Dec nodded. You're right, Mari, he said. I think all of us are just a little overly anxious right now, especially about someone with such a powerful history coming out of that canyon soon. Mother, are you doing all right? Pato asked, considering that Lemuel Thorne is coming. Well, I'm not happy about his invasion, Mari said. But we know what to do. We're prepared, so we don't need to fear. Now, you're scaring your poor children into thinking their grandmother is losing her wits, but I'm not. All of you stop fretting about me, and let's make sure all of our neighbors are as prepared as we are. Didn't Rector Shin ask us to do that at the congregational meeting? Pato smiled. Are all of our packs prepared? Mari held up the ones in her hands. When the Cadbys come in the morning, we'll have them outfitted thanks to Tabit. Tabit beamed at her grandmother. Then, Pato, let's you and I visit that ill couple down the road. The last thing I want to do is sit in my bedroom and stew. Cephas Brighter and his horse, the second clerk of the day, trotted along the back alleys of Norden. While his task was to verify with the northern rectors and assistants that everyone was heading west, he also had been asked to get a report on the Shins and Zenas's Grandma Travado. She had difficulty walking and was frequently short of breath, but her sons-in-law had sturdy net carriers to transport her to the ancient temple site. Cephas was returning to the estates with the news that all Travados were on their way. As for Grandma Travado's demands as to when her oldest and youngest daughters would be joining her, Cephas answered honestly that he hadn't spoken to either Aunt Calla or Aunt Lilla that morning and did not know their plans. That answer satisfied her only a little, and Cephas made a quick exit before she could pry him for more details or hug him again. He kept to the alleys, since the main roads in Norden were packed with Salemites, all heading west. He nodded in approval that no one was pushing or panicking, but moving at a steady pace. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a young woman with a blonde braid making her way south instead of west, pushing through the crowd. Her pack seemed larger than normal, and something about her struck him as familiar. He stood up in the stirrups trying to see her better, but lost her in the crowd. There was, however, a woman with a brown shawl over her head, crouched and looking at something on the side of the road he couldn't see. Then the crowd became too thick as his horse continued to walk, and she was lost to his sight. He sat back down, feeling a little on edge. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe the woman had dropped something and had gone back to retrieve it. That's why she was going the wrong direction. He scanned the dense crowd again, but couldn't spot her. Knowing his report was expected back at the estates, he kicked his horse into a gallop and headed to Salem. Versa counted to 10, slowly stood up, and watched as Cephas Brighter rode away. She exhaled and tightened the brown scarf around her head, making sure her blonde ponytail was tucked away. That was too close. His father had been right, Ralph thought in relief. Many others were already streaming to the ancient site. Salemites weren't ones for procrastination. People nodded and waved as Ralph Shin and his family entered the line of horses beginning the ascent up the lower middle route. "Good to know we'll be traveling with the Shin," one man called. "If anyone gets lost, you'll know the way, right?" a woman chimed in. Ralph smiled. "There's safety in numbers, and the army isn't even on our side of the mountain yet. We have plenty of time." That's what his father would say, what his grandfather would have said, to placate the nervous Salemites. The crowd, about 60 of them, smiled at him as if the 23-year-old carried as much knowledge, strength, and authority as his ancestors. Ralph felt guilty about that. Yes, he was muscular, but that was because he was a stonecutter, not a soldier. He could maneuver rocks, not armies. Yes, he had the voice, but no real authority behind it, except to startle already unstable officers. Yes, the blood of powerful worldly generals ran in his veins, but he had never tapped into it, nor did he want to. His tanned skin and blonde hair were very un-Shin-like, more thorn-like, his grandmother had once commented, to his discomfiture. Still, Salemites looked to him as the closest thing to General Shin, waiting to fall in behind his family. Ralph wrapped his arm tighter around his 3-year-old son and nudged his horse to enter between two marked trees. He looked over his shoulder to make sure his wife, daughter, and younger brother were still with him. If only Q, with his unmistakable parent-like qualities, were older, he'd be far better in the lead. But Ralph knew that while his younger brother looked like the general, he had the temperament of a spooked lamb. So reluctantly, Ralph nudged his gray Clark, and a few ragged cheers rose up behind him as he entered the forest. It was about an hour later, as the trail skirted past a large meadow, that Madeline gasped. "Ralph, get off the trail and let the others pass. Look who's here!" Ralph twisted in his saddle to see his wife motioning wildly to the edges of the meadow, about 75 paces away. Ralph led his horse off the trail, and Q followed with the pack horse. "I can't believe it!" Madeline exclaimed. "It must mean something. The elk herd!" "Elk herd?" Q asked, as bewildered Salemites continued on behind them, occasionally glancing over. Madeline nodded eagerly. "The one I was telling Mugga about. It's her. M1 right there." "Are you sure?" Q asked. He squinted at the cow elk at the edge of the trees. "They all look the same." Ralph smiled. "Madeline has a thing for elk, Q. She'll know." There, on her left ear, Madeline pointed. You can just make it out. There's a large nick taken out of it, as if she was nipped by a predator, and all they got was part of her ear. That's M1. Q unconsciously rubbed his own ear. And somehow that reminded all of you of Mugga? Madeline chuckled. No, it was much more than that. Look, she's doing it, checking out the meadow. In the shadows of the trees, you can see the rest of the herd waiting. Ralph bit his lip. She looks rather gaunt, don't you think? Madeline's enthusiasm faded. Yes, she does. The herd's always been a bit thinner after snowing season, but this past year, it must have been brutal for them. I'm surprised any of them survived. Oh, if only I could convince her to come to the temple site. We could keep her and the herd safe. His eyes wide, Q looked over at his brother, wondering if Madeline was serious, and how one might go about enticing an elk herd to follow. Ralph shook his head at Q. No elk would be escorting them that day. I wonder what she's waiting for. Madeline peered around. Look over there, Sarai, she pointed for her baby. See the elk? Grunnick, can you see them? Grunnick's attention was at the other side of the meadow. I see doggies, he announced happily. Ralph, Q, and Madeline twisted to look where Grunnick was gesturing. No, Madeline whimpered when she saw them. No, Ralph, we have to... Shh! Ralph hushed his wife, his anxiety growing. Why, Grunnick, those aren't exactly doggies. Q winced. No, they look like wolves. Don't say it, Madeline cut him off. Oh, dear Creator, she looked up in despair. Not M1, not today, please. The matriarchal cow stood her ground, her ears, what she had of them, twitching, and her stare fixed on the doggies on the other side of the meadow. The horses picked up their scent and began to back away nervously. Ralph and Madeline pulled hard on the reins, while Q grabbed the pack mule's harness and turned it around. Slowly the doggies crept out, a pack of wolves, 6 strong. But strong wasn't accurate. They were so haggard and emaciated that they could have passed for starving coyotes. Ralph suspected that if they didn't make a meal of an elk today, they wouldn't have another meal ever. It wasn't a scene his children needed to witness. We need to go, he told his wife and brother. Lots of ground to still cover. What? Madeline exclaimed. Ralph, we have to save her. We can't let her. We can't let her what? Ralph snapped, not realizing he was sounding very general-like. His wife cowered in her saddle, never hearing that tone in his voice before, at least not directed at her. What exactly do you think we can do today? Madeline swallowed. Distract the wolves? How? I don't know, she whimpered. Just ride by quickly. Let M1 and the herd escape. Too risky. Wolves don't attack humans, Madeline reminded him. There's no danger to us. Look at the eyes of those wolves, Madeline, Ralph thundered. They'll use their last bit of strength to take down anything they can get. Q doesn't have a ride, and our horses are getting spooked. Should one of the children fall off? Madeline clutched her baby. Ralph took a deep breath and said quietly, The last day is coming. Maybe this is the last day for M1. If not, it will be in a few days. What does it matter at this point? Tears streaked down his wife's face, and Q stared at his boots and sniffled. Grunnick looked up at his father with concern as he began to realize that all of this might be more than just a family camping trip. Ralph exhaled. Don't be so sure M1 can't take care of herself, he said gently. She likely doesn't even need our help. Didn't you tell me once she stomped on a coyote that got too close to a calf? Madeline nodded glumly. She stomped it to death, in fact. But Ralph, she was younger and stronger then. If she's lasted this long, Ralph cut her off, She's wise enough to last a few more days. He wasn't sure if he was still talking about the elk. She still has her herd, and they can protect her. She can easily outwit a few wolves. But she's grown old, Q whispered, and the wolves are desperate. He wasn't even looking at the elk. We shouldn't have left her, Madeline sniffled. Sometimes matriarchal cows sacrifice. And sometimes they outwit, Ralph snapped. There's nothing we can do, he declared, but get ourselves to the site. Madeline, Q, now. His wife and brother looked at him, astonished. They nodded and turned back to the trail, following General Ralph Shin. It was dinner time, but the army rations were the same for every meal. Shin stood at the edge of the trees of the fort, his security team set up for the night in the stable, along with 30 other men, since Thorne agreed with Beavid that keeping Private Shin indoors and surrounded by soldiers was the best way to provide security. Broodingly, he watched as the army continued to pour into the valley. Reports were that their numbers were down to 75,000. So far, around 1,000 couldn't make the climb, and a few hundred had fallen and been injured. Shin had been hoping for higher casualties than 5,000, but the number would be growing because diarrhea was traveling among the soldiers. Those who were ill but made it this far were being isolated in a corner of the valley, but there simply wasn't enough space to keep the sickness from spreading. The route up the mountain was deteriorating rapidly, according to reports. For once, Shin was glad he was at the beginning of the invasion instead of stuck at the disgusting middle. The healthy soldiers who had reached the valley were making their camps in the deep slush. Tragically, stupidly, there were thousands more Idumeans following the army. Women and even children were probably trying to sleep on top of the ridge or somewhere down in the canyon. Shin tried not to think too much about them, remembering it wasn't his fault they were spending yet another miserable night outdoors, exposed to the cold and illness. It was Thorne's fault. Time was running out. That the army made it this far was remarkable. Surely they'd make it the rest of the way. It was all downhill from here, albeit a potentially confusing downhill. The canyon that led to Salem branched off in a dozen different side canyons. Some were dead ends, some led to other parts of Salem but took many more miles to do so, and from the main trail they all looked identical. Shin would feign confusion as to which canyons were the correct ones. He might be able to stall the army another full day, keeping them from completing the next 4 miles in the couple of hours it would normally take. But there was another option, far more risky, but potentially with better results. Thorne was planning to address the soldiers that night, once they finished filing in, using the valley's acoustics. For the past hour, men had been playing with the echoes by shouting out words and phrases of songs, Nelt's raunchy compositions, naturally, then waiting for the well-enunciated vulgarities to come back, fainter but still just as clear. The soldiers laughed as if they had come up with the greatest jokes. They disgusted Shin. They were so childish. Soon they'd be invading an innocent village, killing any who failed to leave, and stealing everything in sight, yet they were acting as if they were on an extended camping trip, with nothing better to do than look for a jug of mead. From his position, Shin had a clear view of the glacial lake, and not for the first time that day he grimaced. He'd seen that lake before when he was younger, but didn't understand why so many had held it in awe. His father had tried to explain that there was a certain reverence about the water, but all Shin ever saw was an immensely deep pool of clear water, colored with such a pure blue with touches of green that it looked unnatural. Pato had told their congregation that how refugees regarded the glacial lake, actually more of a massive and deep pond, was a subtle test of their readiness for life in Salem. Some refugees were rushed to Salem, like his family, while others needed time to rest at the glacial fort, primarily expecting mothers or those who had just delivered babies. The scouts would take those families to the edges of the water where, if one leaned just so, one could see so deeply into the glassy water that it disappeared in shades of purple. Salemites treasured the glacial lake and rarely touched the water, cautious not to contaminate it. A couple of times a simple raft was launched out over it, for scientists to try to estimate the depth of the pool. They guessed well over 400 feet deep. But no one ever drank from it, and would only gingerly dip a finger in to feel just how frigidly cold it was. As a boy, Shin had always thought that a waste. What was the point of water just sitting there, then? His father explained that refugees frequently had the sensation that they were now sitting in a holy place, and staring deeply into the clear water gave them a sense of purifying, of washing away the world they left behind, so much like the baptism most of them participated in later. They passed the lake to go to Salem, and it was as if the lake prevented the world from following. Those most ready for life in Salem sat there a long time, releasing their fears and worries in a meditative reverie, while those not yet as prepared were tempted to skip rocks across the surface before declaring it was a nice pond and was there something else to do? Today, when Shin first glanced at the lake, his heart had skipped, and not like a rock. Suddenly he understood the cleansing of the water that no one touched, and appreciated that it had remained undefiled for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Not even the ash seemed to have affected it. He needed that reminder that there was purity in the world, and that things could become so clean again. How desperately Shin wanted to feel like that lake today. He recalled how he felt during his bath after coming out of the dungeon, and his longing to be baptized and purified again. The lake could have done it, he thought. He wanted to make his way over to it and dip a finger in to feel it cleansing him, but the lake was ringed by soldiers, and they were urinating into it. It was a grotesque experiment to see if enough men could turn the clear blue into a murky green. Shin wouldn't get to touch the water, nor did he want to now. And ludicrously, there were men crouching by the edge and scooping up handfuls to drink, despite the fact that someone just feet away was coloring the water. Then again, Shin thought in grim resignation, that meant there'd be another dozen or so men in no condition to march to Salem in the morning. As he watched, he realized he had to acknowledge something. There was no way to force the world and Salem together. His plans would have failed. He had claimed that uniting everyone was a noble goal, but really it was just an excuse for adventure. If he had succeeded in bringing the two civilizations together, they would have remained miles apart in thought and in deed. No Salemite would ever have thought to relieve himself so vulgarly in the lake, and few from the world would ever have regarded it as anything more than a large blue privy. I'm glad you understand, young pair. Proximity has very little to do with unity. They have to be stopped, Pugga, he whispered. They can't go to Salem. Look at them. They'll destroy everything. I certainly hope you don't think that you can stop them. I have to do something, Pugga. I just can't let this happen. He walked away from the voice, shouting at him to shove away the temptation, and meandered to the southern side of the glacial fort to brood alone. Well, as alone as he could, with hammer and iron following about 5 paces behind, their swords in hand. During the next hour the valley grew darker, and small campfires popped up all over. The soldiers were in surprisingly good spirits, having already forgotten the haunting voice that had echoed about some long ago and forgotten lieutenant who had died there. They drowned out that warning with their own ugly echoes. This would also be the first time in 2 nights that the soldiers would sleep horizontally, not propped up against a prickly tree, unrelenting stone, or another soldier. That lifted everyone's mood. Many of the men had scraped the snow off the ground and piled it around their sleeping areas in narrow walls. Their thick bedrolls had the potential to keep them sufficiently warm for the night that was proving quite tolerable. Shin thought that was too bad as he made his way back to the stables, iron and hammer close behind. A hard freeze could have knocked out another segment of the army, but the women and children on the exposed ridge certainly didn't deserve that kind of a night. Neither did the Salemite families he hoped were at the ancient site many miles away. That was probably why the weather was so pleasant, to give the fleeing Salemites better conditions. But it also gave the army better conditions. He sat moodily at the front doors of the stables. A bonfire at the front of the fort illuminated masses of soldiers. Movement caught his attention. Thorn was leaving the fort. Shin straightened up. This was it. He stepped out of the stables. Iron and hammer followed Shin again as he weaved his way through soldiers to reach the back entrance of the fort. He tiptoed between bedrolls laid out along the floors, and since all of the guards and officers had followed Thorn outside, he didn't face any resistance. Iron and hammer tracked behind him, silent but watchful. At the front observation room, Shin looked around for the object he had spied before, crumpled and ignored in a corner. A folding ladder. Shin noticed his two guards had caught up, and he smiled guilelessly. I just want a better view. I'm trying to remember distances, so I'm going to use that ladder to climb to the top of the roof and get a better look. I should be secure there, right? Iron and hammer looked at each other and shrugged as Shin undid the folded ladder, slipped the metal braces over the bends, and propped it up against the hole in the ceiling. As he put his first foot on the rung, he was struck with the memory of the ladder in his dungeon that he climbed to get through the ceiling to freedom. He would be climbing through another ceiling to freedom again, but not necessarily his. He reached the roof, climbed out, and searched the darkness above him for the bottom of the next ladder that went up the massive ancient pine tree. Camouflaged in the branches that hung over the roof, he saw it. He jumped and caught the lowest rung, pulled himself up, and began to climb higher into the tree until he found a sturdy perch. He slipped off the ladder and sat on a thick branch. By twisting a bit here and there, he found a way to peer through the branches for a view of Thorn below. One of the general's guards blew his horn to get the army's attention. The 3 short blasts echoed in the glacial valley, the first blast coming back before the last one was sounded, making the signal sound like a continuous loop. Men in the valley laughed at the result, but they quieted as Thorn shouted, "Silence!" But Shin grinned as Thorn's voice echoed back, demanding that the general be silent. In the firelight, he could see a faint look of disgust in Thorn's face. "I want to tell all of you that you have made excellent progress," Thorn announced loudly, allowing enough time for his words to rebound. "It is my understanding that the rest of the walk will be downhill." The valley erupted into cheers and scattered applause. Thorn smiled at their enthusiasm and waited until the echoes faded. "To thank you for your diligence, I am offering rewards once we reach Salem. As you have been told, Salem is holding many of our people hostage. I am finding Salem not only to feed the world from their stores, which they refuse to share, but to liberate the captives. Therefore, I am offering 100 gold pieces to whoever will bring me Drusus Thorn, Ursula Thorn, or Delia Thorn alive." The gasps reverberated around the valley. 100 gold pieces was 3 years' pay for most of those men. Shin groaned. How could he compete with that? "I am also offering the same reward for anyone locating and rescuing Eltana Jordan. And it has been rumored that there are 2 others very important to me who are still alive in Salem. For news that leads to their discovery, I will offer 20 gold pieces. And I will grant 200 gold pieces to anyone who brings me Jatsi Shin or Pato Shin." Shin buried his face in his hands. It was hopeless. The soldiers were already going mad, yelling, "Let's get there now!" Pugga was right. Lemuel was smart. He knew how to appeal to their greed and knew what would get them up and ready to find Salem in the morning. He rubbed his forehead. Knowing Thorn's propensity for lying, he doubted anyone would see any gold. That was it. His opportunity to expose the general. The crowd's exuberant shouts were just beginning to die down when a new voice rang out over the valley. "And where is this gold, General? Show it to them, so they can be sure this isn't another one of your lies." Thorn whipped around, looking for the source of the voice. Someone near him pointed up to the tree. "Where are you?" Thorn demanded. "Show them, General, that you'll make good on your promise," Shin called down. "But I doubt you can. Why would you travel all this way carrying, or making Healy carry, 800 pieces of gold? It's just another one of your tricks, like telling them that your wife and daughters are being held hostage. They're not. They ran away from you, to the only place that would care for them and shelter them." Thorn was huffing in a fury. He said something to the officers around him, and they began to run into the fort and to the trees. But it would take them a while to reach Shin. He stood up precariously on the thick branch and gripped the one above him for stability. So filled with rage and energy, he simply couldn't sit while he exposed the general. "Salem is a place of peace, General, a place of refuge. Thousands of people have left the world over the years escaping from liars like you, who torment and threaten their lives. Why do so many people run away from you, Thorn? Find one person out there who truly respects you. No one does. They all fear and hate you. They want something better than you, Thorn." He ignored the scrambling of officers below him, trying to find a way up the tree. A few had made it to the roof of the fort, but were too short to reach the ladder in the branches. "Soldiers, he's deceiving you. If you think you're going to rob the people of their gold for payment, think again. Salem has no gold, no silver or jewels either. If you're on your way to find riches, you are all wasting your time. Salem is a place of peace." "Shin!" Thorn roared up to the trees. "Get down here!" "No!" he yelled back, frantic to get the soldiers to understand. "They deserve to know the truth. You're marching to the last day, all of you. If you enter Salem, you begin your own destruction. It's been prophesied and seen. If you try to harm Salem, you will die." The words didn't have quite the effect he was hoping they would. Scattered sniggers echoed throughout the valley. Someone shouted, "I'll find the gold. It's there. He's just trying to hoard it for himself." A chorus of, "He wants it for himself," rose up. Shin closed his eyes in frustration. They couldn't conceive of any other kind of life than what they lived. They had no imagination. The world had seen to that years ago. Destroy their imagination, you destroy their ability to imagine something better. But he couldn't quit. "There are no riches. There are, however, homes, herds, flocks, and land that the Salemites will share." Another round of laughter and sniggers interrupted his speech. Apparently, sharing was something they quit believing in when they were toddlers. "I'll take the land," a soldier shouted. "They can have my rock-hard farm and trades." Shin couldn't hear anything else because the soldiers exclaimed what they too would be willing to take from Salem, their jeers and calls echoing throughout the valley. He thought something whizzed by his head, but in his discouragement he didn't pay it any attention. Even after living there for nearly 2 years, he hadn't fully appreciated the world's insatiable greed. Maybe they just didn't understand. "Stealing will cost you your lives. You will die." "Better to die rich and young than live poor and long, men," a voice shouted. Thorn. Every man in the valley seemed to agree as they cheered. The shouting continued and developed a rhythm to it. A moment later, the word became clear. Gold, 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 gold. Thorn looked up into the trees with a triumphant sneer. Shin sagged in defeat, almost forgetting to keep his grip on the branch above him. No one believed him. No one wanted to believe him. And why should they? It wouldn't get them what they wanted. They wanted gold, land, and, Shin heard among the shouts, girls. His gut chilled as he imagined his little sisters and cousins falling prey to the rough crowd below him. Again he thought he heard a strange whizzing noise like a lost hornet, but dismissed it. There was a commotion near the tree. More men were there trying to boost each other to reach the ladder rung. Shin looked up to see how much higher he could climb, but he was nearly out of tree and ladder. Suddenly something stabbed his neck, as if indeed a hornet had revived from the long cold and decided just then to sting him. His hand went up, feeling for what caused the pain. Something small and hard had punctured his flesh, but it was too big for a hornet. He yanked it out and peered at it in the dark. He couldn't be completely sure, but it seemed to be a small arrow, the kind of weapon Nelt had called a bolt, fired from a small crossbow. His stomach churned. If the tip was poisoned, he would die in half an hour. Already his head began to sway, and he felt his eyelids trying to close. His grip on the branch above was weakening. This was the end, already. And if the bolt didn't kill him, the fall from the tree would. His hand slipped from the branch as everything darkened. At least he tried to do some good in his last minutes. Ralph looked around the ancient temple site as the sun went down. Salemites had arrived. It was beginning. All of it. He'd prepared his entire life for such a time, and now that it was here, he felt off. He couldn't pinpoint what was wrong. The passage of people up the routes was going smoothly. Those arriving from the northern routes also reported no problems or setbacks. Everyone seemed to feel the need to report to Ralph Shin, even though one of Shim's assistants was there to record concerns and keep a tally of who arrived and from where. Ralph folded his arms and looked over at the tent he'd erected. Most people would be sleeping under the cold stars, but those with small children were bringing tents, hoping to corral their crawling babies into something safe. He heard quiet giggles coming from theirs as Madeline tried to help Grunnick change his clothes in the dark for bed. Sarai was already asleep, exhausted from the ride up the mountain. Q sat by a small fire outside of the tent, poking the flames with a stick and listening to others with him discussing their travel. He glanced up at his oldest brother, and Ralph smiled reassuringly to him. They were on the mountain now. They were safe. Next to his tent, Ralph and Q had staked out a large section for the rest of the Shins, Briders, and Zenuses. They chose a spot forward of the ancient temple site. Most Salemites preferred to set up camp behind it, in the shelter of the mountain peaks. But Ralph knew Mugga wanted a clear view of the valley below, where the army of Idemia would eventually arrive, trampling down the grasses struggling to emerge from the snows. The Shin sons had strung a rope around the campsite, and as other teenagers arrived, they would be in charge of patrolling the line, making sure babies and toddlers didn't cross it and venture to the cliff. There was nothing left for Ralph to do. He had checked the bubbling spring as soon as he arrived, and was satisfied that it was flowing adequately enough to service all of the coming Salemites. The waterfall it created off the cliffs would likely be just a trickle by tomorrow night. The vast tableland was free of predators and debris. Latrines had been dug years ago and were waiting on the perimeter, and there was nothing left to do now until the first light came and he could begin carving their story on the rocks by the temple site. So what was wrong? He had no idea what happened to M1. As others arrived at the site, he surreptitiously asked if they had seen the elk herd or the wolf pack. No one reported seeing or hearing anything. He couldn't get her out of his mind, standing at the edge of the woods, calmly observing those who would destroy her. The sunset that night had a strange, dull brown, similar in hue to elk fur, darkening. Jatesy opened her front door and smiled quizzically. "Uncle John? I heard you were up in the mountains whispering sweet nothings." John Offer nodded officiously to her, and behind him Timon waved. They followed Jatesy into the gathering room, and John pointed at Tabit, who was on a sofa reading. "You're the one!" John boomed cheerfully. Tabit shrank in surprise. Her mother shrugged and tipped her head. She'd be fine, just do whatever Offer wanted. "You're the one Guide Zena said is a swift scribe, correct?" Closing her book, Tabit nodded and stood up. "Yes, Uncle John?" None of the children were still quite sure how to respond to him and his changing moods. While they were always polite, they were also always on guard. Right now he was clearly in colonel mode, and the children didn't know much about army officers. "I need something scribed for me, quickly and largely, so that I can read it by dim candlelight." "Of course," Tabit said, rushing over to a bookshelf where she kept a variety of parchments and quills. "How large?" she asked, analyzing the nibs for the broadest one. John was already striding over to a copy of the writings on a side table, thumbing through it. "I need this right here. The great guide Hiram's final prophecy." "Uncle John," Jatesy said, taking the book from his hands, "you can just take the entire book with you. We have several copies. Don't you have one?" "I do," he said, handing it to Tabit, who was already situating herself at the writing desk. "But I can't fold this up and carry it in my pocket, especially if I need to run away from the army." Tabit stared up at him in worry, and Jatesy pursed her lips. John jabbed a finger at the passage. "Start with this line right here, 'When that last day comes,' and end it here." He pointed to another spot. "Make the words about this big," he indicated with 2 fingers. "My eyesight isn't the best by candlelight." Biting her lower lip in concentration, Tabit began to write, her neat, clear script nearly as perfect as the typesetter's, but larger. "John," Jatesy began, "exactly what are you about to do?" "Educate the army of Idumea," he declared cheerfully. Jatesy turned to Timon. The small man smiled. "It's true. We don't have much time. We need to get back to above the glacial fort tonight. We just finished chatting with Guide Zenas about what John should be shouting down at the soldiers as they try to sleep. And Shem suggested the last prophecy. They deserve to know what's going to happen." Already Jatesy was beginning to chortle. "Have they recognized your voice yet, John?" "Of course," he said. "Took Lemuel a few minutes, but once I reminded him that he'd sent both me and Raiden to find you all, and that the top of the mountains was where Raiden actually died, well, he figured a few things out." Then John's shoulders sagged. "But naturally he'll dismiss everything I reminded him of. This, however," and he pointed to the words Tabit was pouring out of her quill. "Some of them might remember. Some of them might have seen an old copy of the writings, and they'll remember what's coming. I may not be able to scare off the army, but the words of the guides and the Creator certainly might make them think twice about things." Tabit soon was finished, blowing gently on the page to dry the ink. She handed the parchment to John. "Will that suffice, sir?" He was grinning at the page, but abruptly looked up at Tabit. "Sir? I'm not sir. At least not to you. Uncle John will suffice." Tabit grinned. "Well, you're acting rather colonelish right now. Sir just seemed appropriate." John smiled back. "I have to admit, at times like this I wish I still had my colonel's jacket, just to give me that extra but I wasn't wearing it when the scouts jumped me in the world. I left it behind." Tabit and Jatesy exchanged the same look. "Uncle John," Jatesy said, "I just may have a solution for you, but first I need to check with someone. Do you have 5 minutes?" "Not really. We need to get back." Jatesy was already pulling him to the door, and he and Teeman jogged with her along the dark lane to the Shins. A moment later they burst through the door and waved a hello at the handful of family in the gathering room. Jatesy called, "Mother, where are you?" She came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Jates? John, you're back from the mountains. Why?" Jatesy was already charging down to Mari's wing, with her mother, John, and Teeman following. "I'm sorry, Mother," Jatesy explained. "I really should ask you privately first, but they need to head back to the glacial fort. John's going to call down Guide Hiram's last prophecy to the soldiers during the night, in case they have trouble sleeping, you see." Mari burst out laughing as they all stopped in her small gathering room. Jatesy grinned back. "John was saying that he wished he still had his colonel's jacket to wear, and I thought that maybe—" Mari stopped laughing when she realized what Jatesy was asking her to give up. She glanced at John. He looked a little perplexed himself, but hopeful. Perrin would have done it. That's what she thought immediately. Perrin would do it. Without a word, she went into her bedroom and pulled out his old colonel's jacket, which had been taken in the year before for Pato to wear on his outing to the world. In the privacy of her bedroom, she held it close to her chest one last time, breathed in the fibers of the cloth, and remembered in an instant every wonderful and terrible moment Perrin experienced while wearing that jacket. Then she brought it out to John Offra. His jaw slackened when he realized what it was. "You saw him wearing this," Mari told him, "the night we left Edge. It was inside out, but it belongs on a colonel, and Colonel Offra, it needs to be used properly. Would you take it out for one last adventure?" Gingerly, John took the jacket out of her hands, as if being handed a most precious and valuable treasure. His hand ran along the patches and paused where the Shin label used to be. "We removed it when Pato used it last year. You can remain anonymous should any soldiers see you, but you can also blend in with them," she realized, "as long as they don't notice the brass buttons." John couldn't speak, his fingers gliding over the buttons and stitching more reverently than Mari expected. Any qualms she felt about lending him the uniform were gone. If it were possible, John loved the jacket more than she did. She took it out of his hands and held it up for him to try on. He looked as if he didn't dare, then suddenly couldn't wait to put it on. Since it had been taken in for Pato, the sleeves were a bit short, as was the torso, but the shoulders and chest fit perfectly. "Oh," John finally breathed out, "it's beautiful." "Thank you," he whispered in his childlike way. "Thank you, Mari." Teeman grinned. "Colonels Offra and Shin ride again. Shall we, sir?" Something joyous flared in John's eyes. "Indeed," he roared. "We've got an army to lecture." In an instant, he and Teeman were racing out of the house into the night. Mari couldn't help herself. She laughed along with Jatesy. "Oh, how I wished I could go with them," she said wistfully. "But I imagine we'll hear the reports." Jatesy put an arm around her. "Sorry to spring that on you, Mother, but I'm glad you gave him the jacket." "I am too," Mari said. "Perrin's a general now anyway. He didn't need that anymore. We didn't need that anymore." She almost believed that. Later that night, Mari heard the knock on her door and sighed. It was late, very late. One of those days that would never end. After she gave Perrin's jacket to John, She had spent the rest of the evening down the road, helping a young mother organize her packs for her children, since her husband was trying to recover from a stomach ailment. It was wonderful to work away the night, helping someone else. She was now ready for bed, but had been looking at the bookshelf for something to read. She'd been staring at the shelves for several minutes now, trying to find something to shut down her mind to let her rest. But considering that the last day was coming, she couldn't figure out what she should read, aside from the writings which she read every night. She had just been ready to climb into bed and start another thorough reading of the prophecies when the soft knocking at the door came. She put on her bedclothes covering and went to the door. "Ah, I wondered when you might be by," she said to the young man standing there. "Heard about my little time out this afternoon?" Dr. Bosco Zena smiled apologetically. "I don't know what you're talking about, Aunt Mari." She rolled her eyes. "I'm sorry about the lateness of my coming," Boscos continued, making a valiant effort. "But Papa wants everyone over 70 checked for their ability to handle the coming journey." Mari tipped her head. "Uh-huh. You may not know this, Bosco, but over the years, your father would send me his scout hopefuls after their course in deception. I was their final examination. After a conversation and debate with me, I would tell Shin who passed, who needed more work, and who was such a hopeless liar that their only option was to quit the scouting corps and become a doctor." Dr. Zenas blushed. "Well, come in," she sighed loudly. "Do your duty so you can report back to your father that you had verified that Mari Shin isn't going grainy." Boscos chuckled as he walked into her gathering room. "No one thinks you're going grainy, Aunt Mari. We're just concerned about you." "Enough with the concern!" she exclaimed, plopping onto her cushioned chair and holding out her arm. "Pulse first, right?" Bosco smiled and took her wrist. "It's beating, isn't it?" Boscos nodded slightly and continued to count. "You can hear me breathing, right?" He glared playfully at her. "Look at my eyes. No dilation of the pupils, and I can even tell you the dates of your son and daughter's birthdays, too. My mind is fine, Boscos." He released her arm and nodded in satisfaction. "Anything feel sluggish?" "Compared to what? I'm 74. Everything feels sluggish, boss." He smiled patiently. "I mean, on your left side. Any trouble talking today? Moving your legs?" "I never have trouble talking, boss. No palsy, no drooping, no slurred speech." "Obviously." "No, nothing. Go home and tell your father I need no more of his babying." Boscos held up his hands in surrender. "All right, most dangerous woman in the world. And I thought Uncle Perrin was an ornery patient." Mari softened. "Sorry, boss. I would think people would be far more concerned about your sister Miki, who's expecting a baby, than they are about me." "We're worried about her too, Aunt Mari," Bosco said, a little bit defensive. "Mama wants her and Clyde to leave tomorrow with Lori and Jory and their families. They can help her deal with her bouts of sickness." "Good," Murray said. "I'll be glad to see them going on their way. Make this a good experience for the children, if possible. What they don't know—" Bosco sighed. "Brighter knows. He's been in a panic for a while. He even pulled out the writings all on his own and read about the prophecies of the last day. Lek and Salima couldn't calm him down. He kept asking if he was going to die." Mari slumped. "Oh, Brighter, the poor thing." 7-year-olds can understand a surprising amount, but not enough to fully understand. Now he's got Fennec all worked up, too. They're demanding to know what's going to happen, and the fact that their parents and grandparents don't know everything either, well, that's not helping much. Papa gave them a blessing of peace, that they could find faith and hope. Fennec started to calm down, but Brighter, He's at that age when he's beginning to understand just how terrible the world can be. And every time he looks outside and sees the gray banners flying, he panics all over again. What can we do? Bosco smiled dismally. I just left their house a little while ago. That's why I'm so late. We finally decided to sedate Brighter, just to get him to sleep. Mari's mouth dropped open. He's inherited Perrin's sleeping problem, hasn't he? I'm not sure, but he inherited the solution. Oh no, she sighed. Then she remembered how opposed Shem had been about her sedating Perrin back in Edge when he couldn't sleep. Have you told your father what you had to do? Bosco scoffed softly. It was his idea. Said it worked for Brighter's great-grandfather. It might work for Brighter. Apparently he hasn't slept for the past 2 nights, and Salima and Lek were getting desperate to find a way to help him. Oh, the irony of it all. Is he sleeping now? I watched him for half an hour to make sure I had the dosage right. It's rare that we use sedation on children, and I purposely used half the recommended amount just to encourage him to sleep, not be helplessly unconscious. Mari could see the worry in his eyes, so much like Shem's when he was younger. How many more children and adults are panicking like this? Too many, Boscos admitted. Dr. Toon has been advising the doctors and midwives in ways to help people relax. I don't know if it's a lack of faith that's causing the fear or what. We don't have time to analyze the responses, unfortunately. Just react to them. I hope we're reacting correctly, he finished quietly. How did you feel when you saw Brighter drop off to sleep? Bosco shrugged. Well, relieved that he was finally calm. Guilty that we had to resort to that. Uncle Perrin was so adamant about never being sedated. Mari reached over and took his hand. Don't make any judgments about if the decision was correct or not until you see Brighter in the morning. If he's rested and better able to cope with the stress, then you'll know it was a correct decision. If nothing else, at least his parents will sleep tonight, and they'll be able to better take care of him. Bosco squeezed her hand and smiled. Thanks, Aunt Mari. I hadn't considered that. He paused, then said, Are you sure you're all right? You can tell me, you know. Worries? Nagging pains? She sighed dramatically. For me to list for you my nagging pains would take all night. Top of the list, Shem and Kalazinas. Next, Jatsi Brighter. Then Pedo Shin. Boscos chuckled. Understood. But really, call for me. If you feel anything's not right, please. There's no one I'd rather have checking my bunions than you. Then I'll wish you a good night. I wish you one too, boss. You look like you need it. If you're dead, you don't feel pain. That was the obvious conclusion Shin came to as he felt his neck throb and his wrists ache. He kept his eyes shut while he tried to clear the fuzz in his mind, to understand what had happened. He had been standing in the tree, the officers just starting to climb the ladder, after realizing one man could lift another to grab the lowest rung. Then he felt the stinging in his neck, and everything went dark. He'd been poisoned, but not killed. But who had the capabilities to do this? And why weren't they targeting General Thorne? His breathing's changing, he heard a voice near him. Staff Sergeant, he's coming out of it. Shin decided to open his eyes and meet his doom. The area was dark except for a nearby lantern. He was in the stable, lying on his bedroll. The stable was packed with sleeping men, except for some of his security team who sat around him keeping guard. The first face he focused on was Cloudman, and he was beaming. Did you know you bounced when you hit the ground? I tend to do that, he whispered. What happened? You slipped from the tree, Cloudman said, and gestured to Shin's neck. Looks like a branch stabbed you on your way down." "Sure it was a branch?" Cloudman shrugged. "That's what it looks like. You're scratched up, too. Good thing you tumbled through so many branches on your way down, or you would have hit the ground a lot harder. But the branches weren't too nice to your face." He held up a damp cloth he'd been using to wipe Shin's wounds. It was streaked with blood, but not excessively. "Clouds would have been kinder to fall through," he added knowingly. "You've been asleep for a few hours, but should be feeling all better soon." Shin doubted that. In his mind, he ran through the list of questions Boscos asked him whenever he woke up from an accident. Eyes, he could see relatively clearly. The fuzziness would fade. Ribs, he took a deep breath, but nothing stabbed him. Shoulders, still intact. No other appendages felt broken, miraculously. Bruising, most likely, but he was used to that. In fact, the only pain he felt, beside the annoyance of scratches on his flesh, was in his wrists and his neck. He went to reach for his neck and heard chains instead. He glanced down at his arms. Shackled. What a surprise. Sergeant Beavid, on the other side of him, nodded to his wrists. "Thorn now sees the depth of betrayal you're capable of," he said gravely. "Even going so far as to discredit him in front of the entire army. Until he's finished with you, you're to remain in chains. Your ankles are also bound. You'll be able to walk, but you can't run." Shin sighed. "When will he be done with me?" "Unsure," Beavid said, with a tone that sounded like he was preparing for a funeral. "Amory insists they need you to get through the canyons. Then it seems Thorn wants to present you to your mother as a prelude to peace with Salem." "Jadesy's not my mother, Beavid," he groaned. "Think about it. None of this makes any sense. Thorn is delusional, and none of you question him. Supposedly I was born in the forests, but raised in Salem. How? If I were rescued by the Briders, how did I get over the mountain to come back? Thorn did pursue Jatesy Shin, but she was married for over a year before her first child was born. Highly unlikely that Thorn was the father. It's not that difficult of a puzzle if anyone would just look at the pieces for 5 seconds. None of it goes together. I'm only 19, and that's the truth. Jatesy Brider's first baby was a girl." Beavid exhaled, not even questioning how Shin knew that detail about Jatesy's oldest child. "None of that is going to help you, Shin." "So I'm supposed to go along with all of this?" "If you want to live, yes." "Is that what all of you do?" Shin exclaimed. "Just go along with whatever unbelievable and unlikely story preserves you for another day?" "Yes," Beavid said shortly. "Why not?" "Living in lies? Doesn't that bother you?" Beavid leaned in. "What bothers me is the idea of dying, Shin." "Doesn't bother me," he said, almost believably. "Look, Shin, just—" Beavid groaned quietly. "I don't know what the truth is myself, but I do know this. You have a chance to survive this. A small chance, getting smaller each time you open that big mouth of yours. But if I were you, I'd cling to that chance. Do whatever it takes to preserve your life. You can fix the lies later if necessary, but you can't if you're dead. Now, Thorn plans to present you to Jatesy Shin, and if all goes well, he just may set you free. Give you to her." "Of course he will," Shin said dully. "And what if Jatesy Shin can't be found, or Thorn thinks she's dead?" "Then you most likely will be too," Beavid admitted. "Why did you do that?" he whispered earnestly. "Climb that stupid tree and— What were you thinking, Shin? That the army would suddenly, I don't know, rally around you? That you could possibly offer them something more tempting than General Thorn could? This fort is evidence of Salem. You just told all of them that there's land available, and Thorn's the one who brought them this far. Why would they suddenly shift loyalties to you? You're nobody, Shin, with no power, no authority, and nothing to give them. But you sat up there, spouting off against Thorn, thinking, what? I still can't figure you out. And you're supposed to be smart. You're the stupidest smart man I've ever commanded. Shin looked up at the rafters and started counting them. Beavid sighed and slumped in the straw next to him. Look, he said, leaning in close. I'm not here as Thorn's informant or anything. I really just want to know. Did you believe those things you were shouting up there about the last day and all? Shin glanced at him. I do, and it's true. I told Reg earlier today, and I'll tell any man who will listen. We will all die. The Creator will fight for Salem. But Guide Lannard got here a while ago and said that Lannard Croup is a fraud, Shin hissed. He's controlled by Thorn, not inspired by the Creator. He hasn't the foggiest idea what he's doing, and neither does anyone else. Guides aren't mystical and impossible to understand. The Creator wants his people to know all he can reveal to them. He wouldn't be speaking nonsense. There is a real guide, though, Beavid, he said, lowering his voice. And he's in Salem, leading the people and getting them ready. They know we're coming. They've known for years, and they're ready. Beavid licked his lips. What's the guide's name? Shin sighed, realizing that whatever Beavid may have claimed or wanted to believe, he was still an informant. I can't tell you. I don't want him harmed. I've done enough damage to Salem, and I refuse to do more. Beavid sat back. After a moment, he whispered, My grandfather believed in the Creator. When I was younger, he would tell me about the last day, the land tremor, the eruption, the famine, the evil of the world marching to destroy the Creator's chosen. I can't get his words out of my mind, no matter how hard I try. We are the evil of the world, aren't we, Shin? It's all true, isn't it? Shin studied him, trying to discern if this was another trap or if the sergeant could set aside his duty for one sincere moment. You've seen the signs, Beavid. What do you think? We're on the wrong side, Shin, Beavid whispered nervously. How do we get on the right side? It was a trap. While he was unconscious, Beavid and Thorn must have devised this strategy to get him to explain how to get to Salem more quickly. He looked back up at the rafters. If I knew that, Sergeant, I wouldn't be lying in chains in the middle of a stable surrounded by armed men. Good night. But his mind was fixated on what Beavid had said about the last day. Odd that the sergeant would remember so many details. A strange sound came to his ears, almost ethereal, and it was words. Oh, no, not again, Teach moaned nearby. Can't they shut him up? Powell was sitting up, hugging his knees, and Buddy looked up to the rafters as if it was the source of the words. Shin struggled to a sitting position and peered out into the dark open window, recognizing the words. No one knows but our Creator, and its arrival will surprise those who fight against the Creator's people. He began to smile. I know this, he whispered. Do you know how to shut him up? Teach demanded. They tried sending men to find him, but no one can scale those slopes in the dark. On that day, do not be one of those surprised to find yourself on the wrong side. Who is it? Shin asked, realizing that someone with extensive knowledge of the echoes was making the best of them. On that day, do not find yourself with a blade in hand, ready to charge your brother or sister. It's the clouds, Cloudman began enthusiastically. It's not the slagging clouds, Beavid snapped at him. It's John Offra again. He's up there calling down some old prophecy. On that day, be one of the many standing with the guide, having seen the signs and recognizing what is coming. Shin glanced around at the men and realized none of them were sleeping, but were listening to the quiet voice. Outside, a few soldiers were shouting for silence, then being told to be quiet themselves and let everyone sleep. He almost sniggered. Their earlier excitement about invading Salem had to be waning. If nothing else, there'd be a lot of tired, grouchy men in the morning. Before the last day will be a land tremor more powerful than any ever experienced. It will awaken the largest mountain and change all that we know in the world. Those changes will bring famine, death, and desperation to the world. And that desperation will cause the world's army to seek to destroy the faithful of the Creator. Next to Shin, Cloudman lay down and was happily murmuring the echoes. Creator. Shin hoped he'd make it through everything, just so he could finally meet Uncle John. The man was a genius. How long has this been going on? He asked the quiet barn. Someone outside his window began to sob softly. A couple of hours, Beavid muttered. This is his 5th time through it, and always the same. He lets things get all quiet and calm, then he starts up again. Shin mouthed the next lines along with Afra, the words coming again so clearly to his mind as if he'd never forgotten them. Be among those faithful to the Creator. Shut up already, Teach hollered, and the fatigued men around him started throwing straw at him, more annoyed at his outburst than at Afra's calm threats. Be among those standing firm for what you know, having not so quickly forgotten his words to us. Be among those who see the marvelous deliverance from the enemy the Creator will send us. I'd like to see that deliverance, Shin whispered to himself. For he will send deliverance before he sends destruction to those who fight him. Someone whispered, What kind of destruction? Shin, do you know? It sounded like Reg. I don't know, Shin admitted. No one does. Then what about deliverance? Again, I don't know. But I have a feeling we will find out. Someone whimpered into the straw, and Shin grinned into the night. And that's the end of that pretty long section. The end of part 3 of 3 parts of chapter 3, the 32nd day of planting. Thank you.